The article Environment Minister Catherine McKenna on Contradiction at Heart of Canada's Energy Policy, published by CBC, elucidates the concepts and issue at hand elaborated in The Good Anthropocene and Green Political Theory. Oil pipelines have been touted as nation-building projects in Canada, a term that evokes bold feat of nation-spanning infrastructure. But pipeline proposals to connect Alberta's oil sands with British Columbia coast or Atlantic Canada have also done much to tear the nation apart. The Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion project pitted province against province, Canadians against Canadians. Minister of Environment and Climate Change says that Kinder Morgan pipeline can be part of the transition from fossil fuels to low carbon economy. This article examines the relationship between energy policy and climate change policy in Canada. The article finds that Canadian climate change and energy policy have operated in parallel but contradictory directions. The resulting dichotomy helps to explain Canada's failure to achieve significant reductions in GHG emissions. There is a broad consensus in the country that climate change is real and that it's a problem, and that government should do something about it. And the federal government has made commitments under the Paris Agreement on climate change to reduce its carbon emissions by 30% below its 2005 levels by 2030. The government is, however, well behind on meeting those targets to accord with the international commitments. Topical theme for our presentation is anthropocentrism and the environment. The Anthropocene, or so-called Age of Humans, the new epoch of geological time in which human activity is considered such a powerful influence on environment, climate, and ecology of the planet that it has left a long-term signature in the strata record. Canada's proposed carbon prices are an economic signal meant to reduce carbon emissions from producing and consuming fossil fuels. But this conflicts with the fossil fuel subsidies that create an incentive to produce and consume more fossil fuels and which increase carbon pollution. It is tough going green while pumping the black stuff. The Alberta government has also weakened environmental protection from oil impacts. Liabilities for the environmental damage from oil and gas and mining now totals $260 billion according to the Alberta Energy Regulator. And yet the government is approving new projects and allowing the size, volume, and cost of tar sands tailing ponds to continue to increase. This raises the question, how might we explain the contradicting governmental actions in concerns to economic policies and the environment? Following Primo's line of thinking, the rise of awareness accountability for our ecological footprint is explained by warning signs of distress that nature has been demonstrating in the form of natural disasters and ecological catastrophes. According to the author, humans have for a long time misinterpreted and misused our relationship with nature. Instead of trying to master the bond that we have with our surrounding environment, we have been trying to master it through the use of science, technology, and rational forms of organizations. The idea of nature through the continuation of a pre-reflexive narrative of progress becomes the real biophilic deprivation, physical death, and depredation of nature. Politically, Anthropocene lays bare some of the complex crossweaves of vulnerability and culpability that exist between us and other species as well as between humans now and humans to come. Conceptually, it warrants us to consider once again whether the modernization process is complete and the nature is gone for good, leaving nothing but us. Anthropocene has its origin in the earth sciences and advanced computational technologies. Its consequences have rippled across the global culture during the last 15 years. While producing a world of flawed representations, humankind is in danger of ignoring natural laws. These flawed representations of nature are particularly characteristic of modern consumer and service societies. McKenna stated that they are doing hard things, putting a price on what we don't want, that is pollution, so we get what we do want, that is innovation, lower emissions, phasing out coal, making sure we have cleaner fuels, making sure how we build is as energy efficient as possible. This approach of ecomodernism is an attempt to transcend some of the political polarization in current environment debates with a recognition that human ingenuity and technological innovation offer immense promise in tackling ecological challenges. The ecomodernist affirms the traditional environmentalist view that human societies should shrink their impact to leave more of Earth for nature, but rejects the idea that humans should attempt to harmonize with natural processes. Instead, they argue the goal should be increasingly to decouple human development from natural resource use and environmental impact. Thus, they aim at deepening and extending the mistakes of capitalists. Indeed, we have already entered the era of physical limits of the planet, but the capitalist economy, obsessed with the maximization of profits and capital, cannot conceive of anything else than the search for growth and exploitation of physical resources, resulting in denial of non-identity of nature. By violating its otherness and trying to turn it into a malleable object, nature has been rebelling and showing signs of affliction. Especially, eco-capitalism not only offers no guidance for revolutionary action, it advocates the capital-intensive tech fixes such as nuclear energy and carbon capture that the corporations would be delighted to have us spend trillions on. For example, BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Total spend a combined $200 million per year on lobbying designed to control, delay, or blocking binding climate-motivated policy, says a report by Influence Map, a non-profit research group. These five companies also spend $195 million annually on branding campaigns meant to portray them as energy transition champions, even as they drastically increase spending on fossil fuel extraction. $200 million in lobbying plus $195 million in greenwashing is more than enough to keep the system rigged.
So, in concerns to the second text for our session, Richard Sennett highlights how organizations and capitalism has evolved since its time in the beginnings of industrialism. In the desire to free ourselves from the shackles we faced with bureaucracy and hierarchy in earlier forms of capitalism, we created a more global and flexible and segmented organization with time. We believed that this flexible capitalism, which Sennett calls it, would provide us with greater freedom. However, this resulted in unanticipated changes. These unintentional cultural and structural changes have resulted in an economy of impermanence, which has shifted the mindset of individuals, but also of society and organizations, of course, to a short-term focus. So the author underlines three main changes, which is the loss of structure, the loss of institutional loyalty, and the diminished informal trust and weakening of institutional knowledge. So Sennett really believes that our new fragmented flexible capitalism is actually or has actually created an economy of impermanence, which has presented a great deal of uncertainty as individuals are consistently faced or constantly faced with the impermanence of a constantly changing environment. So this has forced them to really focus on the short term as everything is so impermanent. So therefore, in the regards to our question, Sennett would say that faced with the fragmentation and the impermanence of our new flexible capitalism, the Canadian government has focused on short-term goals, such as maintaining the oil and gas industry's strength, which this has been an important piece of the Canadian economy for so many years. And it should be mentioned also that governments make decisions in terms of being reelected, making organizations happy, making people happy, and this is very much so in their short-term objectives. Not to say that they haven't committed to long-term objectives in concerns to the environment, but they are very much prioritizing the short-term ones. So, such segmentation has created the contradiction with the government's commitment to the reduced emissions, this commitment that they've made in Paris 2030, and other green initiatives. The contradiction is due to the government's tendency to want to remain flexible and really focus on those short-term goals instead of focusing on the bigger picture through a long-term perspective by prioritizing the development of a more sustainable energy industry for the future of our environment and our economy both together. As we can agree that, or it is stated in the article, that these subsidies are slowing down that switch to a more sustainable energy industry. So, on similar lines, Frémaux focuses on individuals' relationships with their environment and goes further in trying to explain how we've gotten here, really through the human nature relationship. And maybe Frémaux would explain more the basis of how we've or why we've structured ourselves in such a way. But Senate really provides an explanation in terms of how we've decided to organize ourselves, how society functions, and how our economy functions, since, in reality, we are a very economically centered society. So to come back to the answer to the question, it's really in Senate's mindset, it's the inability to, maintain maximum flexibility while pursuing long-term objectives. That is the struggle for the government in this situation. And we can ask ourselves, will our future be increasingly limited by the decisions that we make today in our inability to commit to some form of permanence or a long-term objective? Will the fact that we can't commit to long-term objectives in terms of our environment, will that in the end up being more constraining than actually committing to this objective right now?
In regards to how we might explain the contradicting governmental actions, now let's have a look at the different assumptions and ethical implications.
In answering our question, the author that we found most relevant is Sennett. In best explaining the reason for the contradicting governmental actions and concerns to the economic policies, which have been to provide very significant subsidies to the oil and gas industry, despite the pledge to reduce CO2 emissions and other green initiatives, which of course are not supported through these subsidies. So Senate really provides an explanation to the prioritization of short-term political and economic motives. And we truly believe that this is the most relevant explanation. Although we don't discredit Frémaux's explanation of the human and natural relationship, which is truly at the source of the environmental issues which we are faced with now. Humans, anthropocentrism, and the view of nature as a commodity is definitely part of the problem that we are facing. However, it does not concretely provide an answer as to why, despite its pledge to protecting the environment, the government decides to act in a contradicting manner by continuously providing subsidies to an industry which is clearly hurting that long-term goal, and is also slowing down the objective, or which would be the ideal outcome, is transitioning to a cleaner or more sustainable energy industry for the Canadian economy. So although Frémaux makes very interesting points in regards to this, Frémaux maybe touches more upon deeper issues than truly being able to explain how our institutions in power how is their relationship with the environment, and why are we having such an issue with pushing these long-term objectives versus short-term ones. And in concerns to Smith, Smith argues that human rationality and self-regulating markets would really be able to take care of the issue single-handedly. Smith would say that government intervention is just probably the reason that we're having this problem, and just government intervention should not be happening. However, we can clearly see through current situations and everyday proof that human is definitely not, or does not act rationally in their best interest in preserving the environment. We very well know where many of our products come from, how they've been made. We still choose to buy them and support those organizations. So we've decided that Smith's answer is definitely not as relevant or credible in thinking that government intervention is just not at all required to protect the environment. Senate also explains that there's a need for a certain amount of hierarchy and structure in our ability to handle issues, whereas Frémaux maybe answers more of how we should approach or how we should solve environmental issues. Senate would really be able to explain the institutional and structural problems that we're having with the government really taking action.